Without further ado, I'd like to now introduce us to our keynote speaker, Dr. Ariadna Matamoros Fernández. She is a lecturer in digital media at the Queensland University of Technology, chief investigator at the Digital Media Research Center, and also associate investigator at the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. Her research focuses on the interplay between user practices and platform politics in reproducing social inequality. She is setting up a research agenda around the platform governments in relation to harmful humorous online expression and has extensive experience in developing digital methods to study digital platforms. Dr. Matamoros Fernández has published on these topics in top peer-reviewed academic journals like Information Communication Society, Television and New Media, and Feminist Media Studies, and so on. So please check out her work. Today, she will be sharing her recent work titled Discussing and Assessing Harmful Humor on TikTok. Through the concept, what she calls harmful humor, she will discuss how these platforms could minimize the harms derived from the playful and humorous expression online. Through this concept, she suggests moving away from considering jokes that punch down on historically marginalized and vulnerable groups as a causing offense, to viewing this joke as both constituting harm and also causing harm online. Playful TikTok trends such as hashtag Mugshot challenge and also hashtag Holocaust challenge are examples of harmful parodies. She will allow us to think about the playful and harmful nature of TikTok's hashtag trends and also cultures in relation to increasing racism, xenophobia, ethnicism on TikTok. After her talk, 10 minutes of Q&A will be following, so please drop your queries directly to the Q&A. So now, please welcome Dr. Matamoros Fernández.
Thanks all. So just for 1 second, I will share my screen. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It is very exciting to be here presenting new work and to be opening the 4th symposium organized by the TikTok Cultures Research Network. But before I start my talk, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara people as the First Nation owners of the lands where now I stand. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, lords, customs, and creation spirits and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. So today, I'd like to talk about the challenge of differentiating between humor that punches up as socially beneficial and humor that punches down as socially harmful on social media. And the reason why I'm interested in this topic is because in my past research on platform racism, I noticed that not only humor was a common veil for hate and discrimination, but that people punching down on social media were often oblivious to the harm they were causing. Now, I use humor here as a generic term to describe the act of joking or the act of making a mockery of seriousness, as humor scholars Sharon Lockyer and Michael Pickering describe the term. There are forms of humor that are more refined in terms of their purpose, like satire and irony, and other forms of humor that are less cryptic, if you will, in terms of their purpose, such as some TikTok challenges that I will discuss later on in this presentation. And my research on understanding better when humor harms on social media is situated within a context where some governments are pushing new regulation to put pressure on platforms to limit the harms carried out through their networks. So for example, in Australia, the online safety bill that will take effect next year hands the e-safety commissioner the power to penalize platforms that fail to remove material online that is likely to cause significant harm to the Australian community. And another example is in the UK, that the online safety bill that is expected this year not only wants platforms to take care of illegal content, but also lawful but harmful content and activity. And this includes misinformation, online abuse, or content about eating disorders, self-harm, and suicide. So these bills want platforms to identify categories of harm that have a sufficient evidence base and to prescribe proportionate regulatory sanctions for them. Now, what I want to argue in this presentation is that the online harms regulation debate in some jurisdictions is a good opportunity to center the experiences of historically marginalized groups regarding what causes and constitutes harm. So there's a need to understand when and how humor harms rather than causing merely offense, and how custodians of public communication, such as social media platforms, can minimize abuse disguised purposely or unpurposely through banter, play, jokes, memes, and parody online. And my point here is that social media platforms and other important stakeholders involved in ending online abuse can adopt a more holistic approach to dealing with harms than that which many legal systems currently support. One that, as I said, centers the voices of those whom the law has been wont to sideline or exclude. So in order to advance this agenda, the first thing that we should do is some definitional work. And I'm proposing a working definition on harmful humor that I developed in a paper that I've written on the topic with two excellent PhD students at QUT, Luisa Bartolo and Luke Troiner. And we define harmful humor as any humorous communication that targets historically marginalized individuals and groups in a way that undermines their assurance as to equal status in the community, and in which there's a clear power imbalance between the speaker and the target of the joke. Now, we argue that humor can be harmful regardless of speaker intent, and the direct target does not need to subjectively experience upset in order for it to be considered harmful. And since I examine harmful humor in relation to public social media communication, by speaker, I mean both the creators of jokes and those who share these jokes online. And the idea is that by proposing and working around the term harmful humor, we can move away from considering jokes that punch down on historically marginalized groups and individuals as causing offense, which is largely subjective, to viewing these jokes as both constituting harm because they are texts that act to subordinate marginalized groups, and also as causing harm because these jokes directly or indirectly trigger harmful actions against the targets of these jokes most of the time, such as encouraging others to discriminate against marginalized groups and reinforcing pre-existing social inequality. And to investigate harmful humor, I use feminist standpoint theory, particularly in its recognition that knowledge is socially situated. And I think this is really useful when, for example, we think about legal definitions of harm, which are not neutral, but they depart from particular standpoints that they represent the interest of largely privileged groups. So it's important to notice that theories of harm, like John Stuart Mill and Joel Finberg, we're only willing to concede the potentially harmful nature of speech acts in a highly narrow subset of cases. So when speech constituted clear incitement to violence and defamation. But obviously this perspective leaves multiple harms experienced by historically marginalized groups unaddressed. And also standpoint theory is very useful on its insistence on drawing on the perspectives of historically marginalized groups to open up new ways of seeing the world and engaging with its problem. So in this sense, thinking about humor and its potential to harm necessitates starting off from the perspectives of those that are targeted by it. But even though some humor scholars like Sharon Lockyer, Michael Pickering, Helen Davis, Michael Billing, or Raul Perez, among others, have argued that power and history are important for understanding the limits of jokes. Their analysis lack a common theoretical framework. And that's why I argue that standpoint theory can help social media platforms and society at large in understanding how humor is harmful. So taking positionality as a framework, that's how our social positions influence the meaning of interactions. So using positionality for differentiating between humor that punches up and down on social media, it's important because this differentiation is very poorly understood by social media platforms and policy. So for example, in this slide, I have added 2 examples of parody, which is a specific type of humor that it's forced to reference that which is mocks. And these 2 parodies that I'm showing here were treated by platforms in a way that negatively affected racial minorities in the US. So on the left, we can see a screenshot from a news article about a video that went viral on Twitter after Trump's victory in 2016. And the video features a Black teenager performing a whiteface makeup tutorial, and her account was suspended by Twitter users that flagged it for being racist. Whereas on the right, we have a screenshot from another news article about YouTube star Shane Dawson when he publicly apologized for having engaged in blackface and other racist jokes at the beginning of his career, without actually YouTube intervening in any of these cases. So Dawson apologized in a moment of collective reckoning in the US on race and racism following the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd. And in the midst of this national cultural audit, if you will, these racist parodies were considered by some, like Shane Dawson, to be more socially unacceptable now than they were in the past. While for racial minorities, blackface has always been deemed harmful. So following Linda Alcoff's call to consider positionality for evaluating the meaning of interactions, the details of who is parodying whom becomes key to objectively determining the harms derived from humor. And in this case, while Dawson was engaging in blackface from a position of race privilege, and while blackface is linked to a history of violence, the Black teenager was engaging in whiteface from a position of racial disadvantage, and whiteface is not linked to a history of violence. So only Dawson's parody can be considered harmful humor, whereas the whiteface parody might have been offensive for some white audiences, but it's definitely not harmful based on the definition provided in this presentation. And on the screen, you can see another example of satire that punches up that Facebook did not recognize either, the same that Twitter did not recognize the parody punching up of the Black teenager. So in this case, the iconic Australian children's entertainers, the Wiggles, announced last month that they would be adding new members and characters to make the team more culturally and gender diverse. And this move was criticized by National Senator Matt Canavan, who complained that the Wiggles had become too woke. And in response, the satirical group wrote a headline that said that the show had introduced a new white Wiggle to help Matt Canavan feel represented. So now this joke is serving a socially corrective purpose by punching up. So the joke has a clear target, Matt Canavan, that is in a dominant position of power. But Facebook was not happy with the hate symbol represented by the white giggle and took the post down as violating Facebook's hate speech policies. So this could have been due both because Facebook moderators did not understand these jokes as satire, punching up, or because Facebook's algorithms recognized the hate symbol in the white wiggle and took down the post. And this shows, as activists have long denounced, that automated approaches to hate speech, unfortunately, end up disproportionately taking down counter speech. So this is the moment in the presentation where I turn to TikTok, and I like to discuss two well-known, I think, harmful parodies that Jing has already mentioned that went viral on the platform. But I would also like to take this opportunity to ask everyone that is listening to think or share other examples of harmful humor that you've seen on the platform during the Q&A, especially because, as Crystal has said, we have a really diverse audience today, and harmful humor is context specific. And I would also like to ask you all whether during your research on TikTok, you've also encountered everyday experiences of users that have been banned for engaging in humor that punches up. So the first example I like to discuss is what was known by the Holocaust challenge. So in late 2020, a trend under the hashtag Holocaust challenge went viral on TikTok, and it consisted of users pretending to be deceased Holocaust victims. The media defined the trend as tasteless or hateful, but tasteless denotes subjectivity, and the challenge was not really motivated by hate. So rather, it is an example of harmful humor where users unreflexively use their privileged position as non-victims of a genocide to subordinate victims of the Holocaust as mere caricatures for the clout. And after different Jewish groups publicly condemned this trend and media reported on it, TikTok blocked the hashtag and redirected those who search for it to its community guidelines, which, by the way, do not really explain how humor harms in these community guidelines. And my point is that in cases of parodies that punch down on historically marginalized groups, in which there's a clear power imbalance between the speaker and the target of the joke, platforms should prioritize minimizing harms to users. Another challenge that went viral on TikTok last year was the Mugshot challenge makeup trend. And in this case, users recorded themselves imitating mugshots, which is a photographic portrait of a person from the shoulders up that it's typically taken after a person is arrested. So some users mugged eyeliner and messed up their hair before posing in front of the camera. Some took the trend further by adding makeup to appear like bruise and to have like blood in their faces. And this trend both like glamorized and trivialized incarceration, which disproportionately affects Black and Latinx communities in the US. So by engaging in this trend, users who are not subjected to racial profiling and police brutality were trivializing systemic injustice. And again, the press labeled the challenge as insensitive, which is kind of subjective too, while for me is another example of harmful humor linked to histories of violence and where most of the participants in this trend probably were oblivious to the harm they were causing. Now, in the specific case of TikTok, the platform does not clearly recognize how humor can harm in its policies. So while the community guidelines of some other platforms like Facebook make an implicit association between harmful humor and vulnerability in various places within the policies, for example, Facebook prohibits the mocking of victims of sexual exploitation, those with a serious disability, and victims of hate crimes. On TikTok, we can only see the platform prohibiting mocking in its harassment and bullying policy. But TikTok policies fail to thoroughly distinguish between humor that punches up and humor that punches down. And in general, too, platform guidelines provide examples of hateful and harmful content that lean towards more overt forms of hate. And it is not clear where humor that punches down on historically marginalized groups would sit within these policies. And another gap in platforms' understandings of humor is that most of them do not properly define specific genres such as satire and parody. And this matters because the platforms protect satire and parody across various policies, which is very important because to protect counter speech, actually, and artistic expression. But a lack of proper definitions that acknowledge for power opens the door for weaponizing these forms of humor as tools for harm. And it is also important that TikTok understand better how the app is being used and how users appropriate some of its most popular technical affordances, such as the use this sound feature, and how they can become harmful. So for example, on this slide, you can see a screenshot of a TikTok video by a popular content creator of Asian descent that recorded themselves exaggerating a Chinese accent. And this example is part of a collection of videos that QUT PhD candidate Alicia Rodriguez and I gathered last year to examine how some audiovisual memes about COVID on TikTok, or what Bondi Kane, Crystal Abedin, and others call oral memes, were contributing to social inequality by normalizing racial stereotyping during the pandemic, especially via users' engagements with digital yellowface and digital blackface, which are common practices on social media in which non-people of color use others' ethnicities or race as a tool of expressiveness. And I think that TikTok's use this sound feature is very interesting to study harmful humor, because, especially in terms of harmful parodies, because it encourages users to unreflexively use others' voices and accents in a way that can reproduce long-running racist and sexist stereotypes. In this slide, I have another example of harmful humor that Alicia and I encountered in our research. And in this case, it's a video engaging with the run trend. The run trend is a reappropriation of a 2015 popular trend from the now defunct short video platform Vine. So during COVID, this trend on TikTok involved users setting a scene wherein people were seen running away from folks of Asian descent due to a perceived association with coronavirus. In particular, in this trend, we saw TikTokers using a portion of a YouTube video about how people of different nations sneeze. So in the video, we have people from places like New Zealand, Turkey, Thailand, and China, that are shown sneezing. And users on TikTok remixed this clip to play the run trend audio just after the person from the Chinese descent sneezed. And the audio is used to cut to chaotic scenes of people running away in public spaces. So in the paper with Alicia, we argue that this trend further perpetuated the yellow peril media discourse during COVID. And the yellow peril trope has a long racist history in the US and Canada and Australia, which origins go back to the mid-late 19th century, when Chinese people migrated to these countries for the gold rush. And their presence was compared to that of a plague. So now the run trend is especially problematic because it happened in a moment where we were witnessing an alarming level of racially motivated violence and other hate incidents against people of Asian descent in Western countries. So we can see how the run trend indirectly was causing harm if we pay attention to the accessible background information that we have, such as the history of the yellow peril trope and the racial abuse people of Asian descent were experiencing during COVID. So to conclude and to just allow time for the Q&A, I'd like to return to my theoretical framework again, to say that recognizing the harms of some humorous communication is a standpoint project, in that it requires starting off from the perspective and knowledges of the targets of this kind of humor. And it has the potential to call out what Dorothy Smith calls conceptual practices of power of contemporary social institutions. And in the context of social media technologies, a critique of these conceptual practices of power can translate into an interrogation of how platforms set and enforce rules about humorous communication. Second, given the challenges involved in drawing causal links between online content and specific harms, it is crucial to conceptualizing and assessing harms in light of society's broader structural conditions. So humor that punches down on historically marginalized groups is an example of an objective harm rather than a subjective offense, whose nature is only truly understood once broader systems of structural oppression are factored in. And last, as I've argued at the beginning of this presentation, I believe that the online harms regulation debate represents an opportunity to be more inclusive in how we think about harm. Because in fact, there's nothing objective or fixed about how a society chooses to define harm. But as scholar John Gardner has argued, shifting definitions of harm act as barometers of our dynamic cultural values. And in a sense, a focus on harmful humor provides a glimpse into what it might look like if platforms and policymakers were to adopt a willingness to evolve conceptualizations of harm in relation to activities that affect those with least power, political power in society. So thanks a lot. I think that I've just rushed a bit, but I hope that you have some questions or examples that you would like to share. And yeah, I think that probably Jean now will take over.
Yep. Thank you so much. This wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. And this idea of a harmful humor is such a provoking, and it resonates within this our culture, like environment that we are facing, especially regarding TikTok. So there is one question from anonymous attendee. So if that's fine, I'd like to raise that question to Ariadna.
Yeah.
So thought-provoking, the focus in terms of a definition seems to focus a bit on harm. I wonder where the cultural meaning of humor gets lost in the global realities of regional platform management. It seems to me that TikTok has a country-specific management mechanism. No? How would the speaker, Dr. Metamorphose Fernandez, consider how best to handle cross-cultural incongruences when it comes to humor? So I guess the person is asking about this region, like very cultural specific aspects of harmful humor.
Yeah, we've seen similar discussions and debates with hate speech, right? So platform just saying that they didn't understand what was happening in Myanmar because they didn't have the cultural knowledge about how like some groups were using coded words to target the Rohingya people. And with humor, I think that it's a bit the same. Some of the humor that punches down also draws on long-running racist and sexist and ableist like practices. So I think that platforms have to be more responsive, like have to do more work with teams on the ground and not only do ad hoc solutions, say when there's an election or when there's like a really big crisis going on, but just because they have the power to be benefiting from a global audience, at the same time, they have to be aware of the context, the specificity of all the regions that really they operate. And even though it's really difficult to scale, I think that more and more, especially like big platforms like Facebook and TikTok, they are like investing resources in really like training content moderations, but it's quite limited. And in the end, we see how policies change, especially in the US context, because you have advocacy groups really lobbying for change. And this creates inequality because some other countries can really lobby these big platforms to get their nuances recognized. So in a way, platforms need to be there's some work that also advocacy working across region can really lobby platforms, because lobbying them, it shows that it works. In the US, Color of Change has been putting pressure on platforms, and lately, for instance, Facebook banned blackface as a form of hate in its policies, and it was not used to be like this. So I think that there's room to little by little be increasing the understanding of how these issues operate across different cultures.
Great. I guess that that platform specific or the region specific, the environment that we are having is a key thing in terms of how to understand the harmful humor, whether that can be punching up or whether that can be punching down. So I think the Ariadna's answer is really touching on very specific or important issues that we are facing when you study TikTok and also TikTok cultures. We have quite a few questions. The first question is from Divina Sarvate. Thank you for your presentation. Given how subjective humor is and challenging content moderation can be, how can platforms be convinced to take this seriously, to create culture-centered policies for this?
So, humor is subjective, yes, but I think that the point that I'm just trying to make here is that when humor targets historically marginalized groups in any region, and also where there's a clear power imbalance between the speaker and the target of the joke, then it's not subjective anymore, but it harms. But I think that what platforms can do is raising awareness is also an option. So sometimes we think about content moderation strategies just as banning accounts or taking down posts. But when COVID happened, and with misinformation, it's being kind of a priority of platforms. And they've done fact checking, and they are labeling posts saying this is misinformation because there's an interest there. During COVID, there was not at all awareness or any move from the platforms to minimize racism against people of Asian descent. And that's something that they could have implemented, at least just putting public announcements and doing more. So sometimes it's a matter of priorities, and because they are implementing measures that go beyond the binary of taking down accounts and posts, and they are taking seriously social problems as misinformation. And on that, I think a clear example also is YouTube, that most of the YouTubers have made a career, some of them engaging with racist jokes and sexist jokes from a perspective of racial and gender privilege. So if YouTube would have been more sensitive of power and history in terms of the meaning of our interaction and how we engage, they have different systems. They have strike systems. They have there's a possibility for them to be creative, and they don't have to just follow, as I said, legal definitions of harm or the way that they define humor in their policies. They could recognize how power really changes the game in terms of the limits of jokes. So I think that if they wanted to, there's the possibility. The same with media regulators that are passing this online harms bill. So online abuse based on research is not only mediated through overt forms of attacks or posts or practices. First, sometimes it's the person that it's causing this harm doesn't know that it's harmful, and others is just through these everyday microaggressions. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a general need to be more conscious about how our social positions really influence the impact. Like Linda Alcoff's work, she has a really excellent essay about the problems of speaking for others, where she discusses positionality and how it impacts the meaning. So things like this, like incorporating critical frameworks in the way that they explain like wicked social problems, like how humor is like a really useful like tool for like empowerment and to talk back to power, but at the same time, like historically has been used to silence like marginalized communities.
I see. Ariadna's answers actually responds to some of the questions that we have. So let me skip some of the questions. And there's a very interesting comments and questions from Tama Liver. He asked, I wonder if your work has seen challenges, even for humans, in categorizing humor when sometimes the audio meme and the visual material might be at odds. So for example, the audio meme is from a trend punching down, but the visuals try to appropriate or subvert that. This would require significant literacy from the viewer to see that as a subversion. So what do you think of this question?
Yeah, totally. So I don't have a concrete solution or like about what platforms should do, but definitely it happens, and it's a similar tension for when like racial minorities repost a racist post, but then the comment is just calling out that post, and then the post gets taken down. But in terms of media literacy, I think that this is also part of what platforms could do better, like really being conscious about how the technical affordances are being used and being more transparent in educating users. And I know that some people might feel like a bit uncomfortable about the idea of US platforms or Chinese platforms educating users, but in combination with different stakeholders and collaboration with advocacy groups, with civil society, we could first know better how these platforms are being used, because like users creatively really appropriate, like they use this sound, and Tam, as you were saying, like the way that then the visuals contradict this use or are calling out this use of an accent, for instance. So we need to increase our knowledge about this and probably spend more time thinking about media literacy interventions, specifically about playfulness, about humor, about parodies, about satire, and not only from the perspective of misinformation, but platforms are interested in satire as labeling satire, saying, hey, this is not misinformation, this is kind of a joke. Whereas they are less interested in how satire is being used as social commentary and its potential. In my case, that's what I'm interested in, to harm.
Right. That's such a thought-provoking thing that we need to think about when you just consume these humorous things. Do we have a media literacy to understand the behind the meanings of this humorous content, or do we have not? Also, regards to that, Alex asked the questions about challenges. So I think there is a connection between what you're trying to say and also the TikTok specific dysfunction as challenges. So he asks, do you see the examples of positive challenges that work towards recognition and or memorialization of those not in power, even if done by not members of the group?
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. If there's a value in like an archival value of some like engagements with humor, is this?
I think so. So for example, like when the blackface challenges coming up from non-Black people of non-Black group of people, then it became viral on TikTok. Then do you think that this can be considered as a movement of social recognition or racial awareness? I guess that's the question of Alex Gelker asking.
There's some value in these debates being like happening in public, so like a platform like TikTok, because obviously like this challenge happened, and you have like a lot of TikTokers from racial minorities saying, hey, this is wrong, and these are the reasons why this is wrong. You have media. So that's why I'm saying, like, by proposing the concept of harmful humor, I don't think that the idea is let's ban all jokes. Let's ban, like, at the moment we see one, let's delete the hashtag. But if platforms think about this, like, beforehand, they can redirect the users engaging in these challenges to their policies, explaining, hey, this is how humor operates. It's a really important tool, but we know that it's being used to further marginalize. So, I don't know, be reflexive about why are you engaging with this, and be reflexive about how your social position is really impacting meaning and truth in terms of, like, your engagement with the trend. So, yeah, Alex, I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but that's what I have to say.
Well, we have 1 minute left. So there are lots of questions that we haven't chance to touch down, but there is one question I'd like to add to conclude this session. So anonymous attendees asked the question, when such microaggressions are not policed, then are you suggesting that TikTok define humor for its user at times? And is this our responsibility to always think about this is racially subversive or not?
If it's users' responsibility?
Yeah, maybe, or depoliticization of the racial politics when you consume this racial, the harm from humor content.
Yeah, again, I think that if the question is about whether, like, if there's a need for, like, users also to, like, be more, like, conscious about how they engage with these types of humor, definitely. But I'm not sure that it is. I don't know, for, like, the way that I'm moving forward this research is that I want to collaborate with, like, schools doing workshops and discussing, like, humor and discussing, like, positionality and power. And again, like, thinking about media literacy, like, responses to humor, because there's a lot of work on sexuality and self-harm, but there's less work in thinking about alternative content moderation frameworks and media literacy responses to humor online, especially humor on social media, being humor such a core of internet culture. And sometimes when we think of humor, we say 4chan, 8chan, these really niche platforms, but actually, like, punching up and down happen really in mainstream practices and in everyday engagements. And I think that this is what is most pervasive, and we need to, like, be a bit better in differentiating between the two.
Got it. Thank you so much. This was very interesting and also very thought-provoking, the content, and we need to think about when we study social movements on TikTok. So thank you again for this wonderful keynote, Dr. Ariadna Fernández Metamorphos Fernández. We will take about 3 minutes break, and then we will come to the session 1 with amazing 4 panelists about new TikTok, new various social movements on TikTok. So I will see you in 3 minutes. Thank you.